Welcome to episode 0 of this new series where I talk about Star Trek, specifically Star Trek Discovery, at least to begin with. I have many criticisms of the show, but none of them are really political. It's hard not to talk about politics though, since it's a fundamental part of Star Trek as a brand, and a lot of people expect politics to come up when talking about the show. This is especially true of internet criticism of Discovery, which focuses heavily, among other things, on identity and social politics. Therefore, I am dedicating the first of my 2 prologue videos entirely to politics, as an attempt to get it out of the way, while also addressing the arguments. If you don't like this video, you might like the next one called the Burnham Test, especially if you don't like Michael Burnham. With that said, let's ask an important question. Why is Star Trek? Why does it exist? The franchise has been around for over 50 years, with 6 flagship television shows, over a dozen movies, multiple animated series, yearly conventions, and enough toys, video games, merch, and cultural relevance to rival Star Wars. Discovery may not be the most popular iteration, but the brand has been a smash success. That part's not really debatable. Gene Roddenberry probably couldn't have imagined how influential his creations would become, but there was a time before that, when he was sitting with pencil and paper, metaphorical or literal. And we know what he was thinking because it's been well documented by interviews and contemporary accounts. He was essentially trying to feed America his version of political medicine, helped down by a spoon of sci-fi sugar. Here's a clip of Rod Serling, the man behind The Twilight Zone, which predated Star Trek by a few years, explaining the basic concept.
You may have to tell them a story of prejudice in parable form, in which they may step aside as third persons and cluck and say, how awful we treat our minority groups. But at least they know that it's an evil, and they will recognize it as such. And by osmosis or some incredible process, will somewhere along the line be faced with a situation in which they too may have to exercise a prejudice and be conscious of it as an evil. Now on Twilight Zone, for example, done during just as timorous a time as any other time, we made a comment on prejudice, on conformity, on intolerance, on censorship, but it's easy to do it when you're talking about Buck Rogers isn't allowed to write his memoirs in the way he wants to write them.
Yes.
So he puts on his backpack, his rocket pack, and he zooms over to the publisher. And they applaud and laugh and think how exciting and interesting. Now, it may well be that the inner message may never get through, but I think peripherally it does get through.
And now, here's an excerpt from American science fiction TV, Star Trek, Stargate, and beyond. Roddenberry points out that by creating, quote, a new world with new rules, I can make statements about sex, religion, Vietnam, unions, politics, and intercontinental missiles. Indeed, we did make them on Star Trek. We were sending messages, and fortunately, they all got by the network. I like this quote a lot because it demonstrates 2 things. First, it shows the intention of Star Trek has always been a message show about politics and social issues. Second, the fact that he felt the need to remind us that the show, quote, got by the network is an indication that the ideas presented on the original series were controversial by the standards of the 1960s. Paradoxically, despite some aspects of the show drifting further to the right over the years, and I'm going to be covering some of that in future videos, a lot of people seem to think the franchise has moved to the left. This is due in part to the fact that Star Trek has been winning the culture war. People my age today don't view the original series as being preachy about social issues because those issues are no longer controversial. Imagine a 37-year-old white guy, aka me, in 1966, whose formative years were in the 1940s, before the civil rights movement and desegregation, watching the first interracial kiss in television history, and probably blowing a gasket. If we could talk to such a person, I'm guessing they would have found the original Star Trek to be preachy, leftist, and woke, or whatever the parlance was back then. If you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but issues from previous iterations were reasonable, the problem is that Discovery takes it too far. Well, first I have to ask, how convenient is it that the exact state of societal issues was at its apex during your formative years? It's sort of like how a driver will say that anyone going faster than them is a maniac and anyone going slower is an idiot, or how Muslims and Christians seem to be concentrated in different countries. no doubt due to individually examining all the options without any bias at all and coming to the best conclusion for them personally, and not because they happen to be born in Muslim or Christian cultures respectively. Seems a bit suspicious to me. I can imagine that 50 years from now, a person doing the same thought experiment about what it would be like to talk to someone my age in 2021 would find my views on social issues quaint, much as we find the views on social issues from the past outdated. I'm not trying to defend a slippery slope argument here. I don't agree with every position that Star Trek has ever taken over the years, but it's important to examine why we believe what we do. Is it because we've really considered everything carefully and worked through all the implications and evaluated them against our values? Or because it was the first and most influential thing we were exposed to? This is a double-edged sword. I would argue that, much like Rod Serling, Star Trek helps to challenge convenient notions about politics and society so that we can look for better ones. But you might argue that Star Trek is the influential and formative media that has set the standards for people coming to age today. And that is setting a bad example based on your opinions. I want to point out that nobody is wrong here. Star Trek is just part of an ongoing conversation. There are no easy answers. It happens to take a progressive view, but it's just one voice among many. Gene Roddenberry had an agenda when he created Star Trek, and there was an intended message behind Kirk kissing Uhura. But that doesn't mean that interracial romances are themselves an agenda, or that interracial couples in real life are part of an agenda. They're just living their life. If I see an interracial couple on TV, I don't think of it as leftist propaganda shoved in my face, because society has evolved past thinking that such a thing is a problem, and did by the time I was growing up. It's just representation now, which is a good thing. Older Star Trek isn't seen as controversial anymore because it isn't controversial anymore. That's what happens when you win the culture war. I'm sure there's still some people keeping the lights on and whining about it, but I didn't even notice that Stamets and Culber were in an interracial couple until they brought Hugh back in Season 2. Spoiler alert. Why would I? Who cares? It's a detail that doesn't matter. I also don't care that Michael is a black woman with a short haircut and a traditionally male name. The show takes place in a distant future with magic mushrooms that teleport the Discovery anywhere they want to go, time crystals and parallel universes. So, if a woman with a man's name triggers you, then I think that says more about you than it does about the show, which is kind of the point. Diversity exists. It shouldn't be impossible for people to see themselves in popular media. Whoopi Goldberg was famously inspired by seeing Uhura on Star Trek as a little girl, which is why she wanted to be on TNG, and her presence probably undoubtedly inspired other young black girls who saw that show in the 80s. This is why representation matters. There are problems with the character of Michael Burnham and some of the choices the show has made with her, in my opinion, but none of them have anything to do with identity politics. When my son was young, we were told by his doctor that it doesn't matter what he eats in a day, it matters what he eats in 10 days. You might need to have some extra veggies on Monday to make up for a weekend of burgers and pizza. Despite all the whining about woke culture, popular media is still dominated by straight white guys, especially behind the scenes. If Star Trek goes a little overboard sometimes with representation, that's fine with me. It just means that Star Trek gets to be my Monday night veggies. I like my veggies, but even if you don't, they're still good for you. For that matter, I'd like to know exactly where the agenda is in Discovery because I haven't seen it yet. Was it the episode where they found a preserved capitalist from the 80s so the captain could give a speech about how humanity is a communist and post-money society and how they don't tolerate greed and... Oh, what? That was TNG? Oh, shit. Okay, well, maybe it was the episode where they found a civilization that thought the captain was a god, and in the interest of protecting them, it was suggested that they pretend to be gods so that people will follow their commandments. And then the captain gives an epic speech about how he won't send them back into the Dark Ages. Oh, fuck, that was also TNG. Oh, boy. Okay, I know why people are mad. I got it. Okay. All right, it was the episode where they directly quoted Karl Marx. Checkmate. One of the main characters told a story about a relative who was a Union hero. I mean, come on, how much more in your face can that possibly... Oh, fuck, that was DS9. Okay, alright, I know why people are mad at Discovery. It must have been the time that the show took place in the past in order to highlight systemic racism by having the main black character be subject to discrimination due to their skin color, and despite their white friends feeling bad for them, also feeling too helpless or apathetic to do anything about it. I mean, if that's not a Deep Space Nine... Oh, that's a Deep Space Nine episode too. I got it. I know. It must have been the time that they dressed the bad guys up as literal Nazis. That has to count as bringing real-world politics into the show and really shoving it into your... Oh, that was Enterprise. And Voyager. And TOS. And... It must have been the episode where one of the main characters falls for an intentionally androgynous alien from a genderless species to make the point that people have rights and dignity even if they don't conform to traditional gender stereotypes. And motherfucker, that was TNG again. Really? God, TNG was really woke. Well, what about the one character whose entire persona was based on living multiple lives as both male and females and as a stand-in for transgender people, and they had an episode where she hooks up with an old flame, and even though both of them are in different bodies, they both still love each other. We go, oh, it's DS9. That was a DS9 episode. All right. Forget about the identity and economic stuff. What about the fact that they forced Spock into the show and then gave the main character a special relationship with Sarek that was completely invented in order to help connect the new show to the original series? Son of a bitch! Much like Steve Rogers, I can do this all day, but I think you get the point. If I know my audience and YouTube's analytics gives me some idea of who you are, most of you are like me. White guys, somewhere between 25 and 45. The problem with new Star Trek isn't that it suddenly got woke. It was always woke. The problem with Star Trek isn't that it suddenly got preachy. It was always preachy. And in many ways, it's gotten less preachy. No, the problem with Star Trek, if you even see it that way, is that for the first time, you're watching a version of Star Trek aimed at you and us. And our generation, and the defining cultural and social issues of our time, and not previous generations where those issues have already been normalized. Complaining that Star Trek suddenly got woke and preachy is like complaining that Elton John suddenly got gay and flamboyant, because both of them have been doing it consistently since the 60s.